Just briefly to introduce myself, I am a senior fellow at the Sorensen Impact Institute. And as a scientist and as a conservationist and someone who's recently joined the world of impact investing, I'm really excited about this session because it addresses the current tension between sort of hope and despair, both of those things. Hope or despair stems from the fact that every dollar spent on nature positive values and actions, over $100 flows to nature negative activities. And the hope, though, stems from the trend that entrepreneurs and innovators in the nature finance space are beginning to make it possible to account for natural assets, enabling CFOs to include them in financial statements and for investors to diversify into natural assets. In this panel, we're going to hear from these four amazing experts who are leading this financial innovation, discovering how some innovators are reshaping the capitalist system to value and align with the natural world. And I'd like to start with some introductions and then presentations by each of the panels. We'll then have a little bit of a discussion amongst the panel members, and finally we'll be inviting audience members with their questions. And I think there's going to be someone here in the back who's going to be circulating pencil and paper for the purpose of transmitting questions to me. So first, a little background on myself as an ecologist. I'm an ecosystem ecologist who spent 40 years in academia. I do research on the ecological interactions of forest canopy biota in tropical and temperate rainforests. I'm also deeply committed to forest conservation, and I work to elevate awareness of the importance of trees and forests to people, especially those who live and work in nature deficit environments. Last year, I was named as an explorer at large by the National Geographic Society, and I also joined the Sorensen Impact Institute as a senior fellow to explore how impact investment and ecologists and conservationists can weave a tapestry of care for the planet. Manuel Piñuela is a self-named serial impact entrepreneur who's focused in accelerating investments in nature. He was named as one of the 35 innovators under 35 and Inventor of the Year by the MIT Technology Review. So welcome, Manuel, and thanks for your presence here. Kaitlin Archambault is the founder and CEO of Open Future Coalition, a global network that develops social and technological and financial tools that have supported grassroots impact efforts in over 70 countries. Kaitlin is committed to making resources, often reserved for enterprise, accessible at the grassroots level to support those solving some of the most pressing challenges of our time. Thanks, Kaitlin, for being here. Samantha, our third panel member, is the founder and director of the BioFi project and the principal consultant of Finance for Gaia. As a regenerative economist and futurist, she draws on her vast experience at the World Bank and in finance to advise ministries and central banks and investors. And Samantha advocates for decentralizing financial decision-making to empower people connected to their local environments. Thanks, Samantha. And last but not least, Dr. Martine Weinstein is a systems thinker and founder and executive director of the Open Earth Foundation, a research and deployment nonprofit working on digital innovations and open collaborations around planetary scale projects. He supports cities around the world with advanced data and AI tools for climate action planning. So welcome, everybody. And before we start with our presentations, I'd like to provide a little bit of context for what we'll be talking about and discussing today. Human activities are damaging Earth's ecosystems, risking $2.7 trillion in economic losses. And of the work that is going on to mitigate this, only 18% of it comes from the private sector. And this really needs to shift, but won't be able to shift into nature-positive strategies until nature can be incorporated into some sort of financial metrics. So the big question that we posed is, how can businesses adopt nature-friendly strategies more effectively and efficiently? And we'd like to pose three questions as each of our members presents. First, and keep these in mind as we open it up for discussion. First, how might companies move from basic environmental practices, or ESG, to deeper, long-term goals that require the building of trusting relationships, even if they don't bring quick profits? Secondly, what are the financial tools that will help companies include nature in their balance sheets? And finally, can nature be fully priced? Some aspects like carbon credits or the growing world of biodiversity credits allow us to do that, but some of the other values, cultural values, aesthetic values, spiritual values, ethical values, indigenous values, personal and historical values are much harder to measure and monetize. And so who should be developing the methods to decide its worth? We've asked each of the speakers to talk about both successes and some of the failures that they have encountered as they have worked towards answering these questions in their work. So let's start with Manuel. And I think he's going, are you going up to the podium? And that's great, that's great. So we'll have an 8-minute presentation from each of our panelists.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to SOCAP, the organizers, Nalini, and the panel, as well as the Nature Tech Collective for inviting me to this. If I can find the clicker. Yeah, there we go. So it's actually quite convenient to be here on the last day of the conference because I've already had a lot of conversations with many of you as to what are you looking for in this type of session and in this type of engagement. So let me just add on what is it that we do at Cultivo and how are we going about it? And yes, we've messed up several times. So the whole purpose of Cultivo is that everything that we do is to regenerate 1% of the Earth's lands. It's insane, I know. That's about 150 million hectares, or to put it in a bit of another framework, 2 states of Texas combined, or the size of Mongolia. But how do we do that? How can we do that? And we started this 6 years ago by tackling that very simple mission, which is how do we accelerate investment into nature? It's actually very complex. But what I wanted to start with is share with you how we see nature and how we start to look into how we can invest in nature for the full natural capital stack that can happen in a land. But at the core of our origin was the fact that we were seeing financial institutions, family offices, corporations, even landowners already knowing that a hectare or an acre is degraded, but not knowing how degraded it is, what will it take to bounce back, and always with the prerogative that it shouldn't be the land steward opening their wallet again to make that happen. So as we were going through that, what we wanted to leverage was a lot of background in technology to understand very quickly that due diligence, the natural capital flows that could come from that plot of land, spend less time doing due diligence, more time investing into nature. So simple stack here where you have the acres, the hectares, the land asset that's as a foundation. That is, in the case of Cultivo, always degraded. So we search for very degraded assets. Why? Because we want a deeper spread in terms of returns of those natural capital flows. Biodiversity, water, in the right social context, and sure, when you have all of that, you can have carbon. But we first go through the land use, and in some of the conversations, we talked about how there should have a regenerating asset should have a lot of streams. So from agroforestry, forestry practices, basically standing forests, could have energy, could have ag, can have also grazing pastures. But there's also a lot of flows on biodiversity, water, and carbon. So how do we do about this? Is that for our customers are financial institutions and corporations. We started with family offices and high net worth individuals 6 years ago. We're now working with pension funds. I'll talk more about how we meet and match the natural capital stack with the right capital stack. But we therefore turn on our platform to identify the land, basically sourcing, due diligencing, building that pipeline for those customers. An example of that I will put on screen is Octopus Energy Investments, renewable energy company, investing in a full climate transition, of which nature is a very important part for them. So much so that they're deploying first $40 million into nature with Cultivo. So we then look into building that pipeline for them, securing forward contracts of bio-based materials, water, biodiversity, carbon, making sure that we're designing and financing those projects in the way that is socially just, and making sure that there's quality across the implementation. So as an example, I just wanted to share with you, I mentioned 150 million hectares. after 6 years of working on this, we now have 233 million hectares. So the 1% is more than there, but we need a lot more capital to achieve it. So let me just show you what our customers start to see at the beginning. The first thing that they see is, okay, here's one ranch in the US, or a series of ranches in the US, that fit Octopus's criteria investment from an IRR perspective, but more importantly, from a couple of things. Very quickly, we get what is the increase in biodiversity. It's a simple measure, but one where we start with, which is the mean species abundance index. It will increase by 94%. We then increase water retention. Why is there a 100% increase here? Well, because it's really degraded. It's the equivalent of 30 Olympic swimming pools per year that we can capture on water just by regenerating that grassland. And the other thing is that we can have a significant amount of carbon being captured. The practices that this project would need are mostly regenerative grazing practices, a lot of hydraulic infrastructure investment, a lot of monitoring, and as we started building those projects, we started to introduce species, for example, to those landscapes so that they are more resilient. But these are just on equivalent returns with a ton of assumptions on them. So this is just a first initial assessment where you see that the investment ticket for this plot of land would be around $1.2 million, an equity value that could be earned 3.52, and therefore that gives you your 23.5% IRR, expected returns, multiple on invested capital on 2.85. That takes assumptions on carbon at $30 a ton, for which we have already signed forward contracts, and we start building it from that point of view. Now, this is just one lens, but then we start looking into, okay, what then builds up that nature case? Treating really a natural asset as an infrastructure asset, that's more relevant when you're speaking to a pension fund than when you're speaking to a family office. But it still starts to balance all of these data flows that bring back to that quality assurance. And now let me share, on the last few minutes of this, a couple of things that didn't work in another project. We started with a cattle operator, a couple of land stewards in the north of Mexico and Texas. So this is the state of Coahuila and Texas, just on the other side of Big Bend National Park. Super degraded asset. For those of you who know, I know that there are many cattle operators in the conference. This is the barrier desertification of the northern Great Plains. And in this case, we started first with a corporate, a large conglomerate with a lot of materiality in that landscape. They first said no. It was 5.5 years ago. We just didn't have enough data for them to be comfortable with the investment, and we didn't have scale. So we had to then not go to the corporate side. That would have been amazing because we would have had all the money that this project needed to onboard even more projects. We failed. 6 months later, we started with very committed family offices that were in love with the land. Sure, we presented an interesting investment proposition, but they really did it from passion. We started with 16, sorry, I'm going to do some translations here in acres. I got criticized by talking on hectares the other day. But so about 15,000 acres. We started with 15,000 acres. We started onboarding that. We then went and increased the number of acres to 50,000, and then we ended right now at 300,000 acres being regenerated. It took us 5 years, but in that process, we went from a family office to a private equity group in Miami. That private equity group just 3 months ago sold that asset to an asset manager in the UK. That private equity group and the family office got an IRR of 55%. It's a very thin book. It could be a red herring, so please don't make your investments into nature expecting a 55% IRR. But as we're starting to move there, that failure on that first engagement with that large conglomerate from the US, they're NASDAQ listed, now is one where they are now committing a lot of the capital that that project needs to get to 500,000 acres across Mexico and the US, specifically on those states, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So lessons there is that the capital stack that you're seeking for a nature restoration project, that natural asset, really needs to fit the audience that, I know it's very obvious. You need to make sure that the asset fits the allocator. But in this case, we needed to build up first catalytic capital as you're proving that the data that you're showing is real to the point that it gets comfortable to a corporate. And we've now started to triplicate that process where we now can get comfort for pension funds. And that's what excites me, because a pension fund is looking at returns at 20 years. That starts to really fit the time horizons, barely, of what nature really needs. Nature cannot have investors cycling all the time. That would be breaking the project. It's really important that our investors, in the case of Cultivo, carry on with that project, because the lifetime of this project is more than 100 years. And with this, just to finalize, we're not doing this on our own. We engage all of those steps. We work with local operators. We've realized that we also made a lot of mistakes assuming that those ground operators that have the trust with our land stewards were going to be enough. It's not the case. There's a lot of convergence that's needed from a research perspective. We work with Berkeley National Labs, with grants from the Department of Energy and other institutions, and yes, venture capital as well, and corporate investment. All of this has to come to build something that is the most complex thing that I've ever done in my life, but it really takes an ecosystem to regenerate an ecosystem. So thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Kaitlin, please inform us.
Hi, I'm Kaitlin Archambault. I am founder of Open Future Coalition, and I'm so happy to be here with you all today. Let's see, figure out the clicker. All right. At Open Future Coalition, we believe that at a time where we're in all these conversations about how do we innovate and solve, that actually many of the solutions to the world's most pressing challenges are already here, that some of them have been here for thousands of years. And so we've really been committed over the last 4 years to connecting and resourcing and making visible those existing solutions. And we support these efforts by bringing access to social, technical, and financial tools, often reserved for enterprise, directly to the grassroots. For the purpose of this discussion, when we talk about putting nature on the balance sheet, I'm not coming, therefore, from as much of a corporate ESG focus, but really from a lens of how do we directly put resources behind those social enterprises whose core missions are already in direct alignment with the thriving of the natural world. So since 2021, we've worked side by side with impact organizations in over 70 countries to launch a platform called Open Impact that combines process management, knowledge management, measurement, and funding tools to solve complex coordinative challenges and support peer-to-peer learning. Those applications have ranged everywhere from coordinating large-scale ecological restoration efforts in the Amazon and the Andes to connecting smallholder farmers with one another, with shared infrastructure, with mentorship and best practices, to coordinating aid in times of displacement. And now, through our Regional Resilience Fellowship Program, we're working alongside 20 regional efforts in 16 countries and 35 project sites, over half of which are Indigenous-led, to document successful practices, ranging from application of traditional ecological knowledge in grazing and fire mitigation practices to well-being-centered approaches to urban planning and development, to launch a living library of existing solutions that will support peer-to-peer learning and contextual scaling. And through the course of this work, we've realized that a lot of what we've actually been doing philanthropically is filling a pre-development gap for the projects within our network. And when these solutions find themselves ready to scale, we've also found that the most readily available capital for them is often limited to thinking around philanthropy or private equity. But if you're a project focused on, let's say, biodiversity and indigenous sovereignty in the Amazon, then private equity is not going to be the fit for you. And so, meanwhile, as Manuel began to touch on today, there's a whole capital stack in between. And as our most recent effort, therefore, we've launched Open Future Fund to support the deployment of what we call contextual capital. And really what that means is that we've seen through the course of our work over the last 4 years in multiple regions and sectors all over the world, multiple forms of financial and non-financial capital that are already working together synergistically, perhaps even applying blended finance without using that language around it. And in these places, there are already incredible local funders that have been doing work in close relationship with their communities. And it's they who have the granularity and acuity that we believe is required to guide resources resiliently into these communities. And so Open Future Fund is focused on directly aligning those resources with the self-determined needs of local communities through 3 approaches. One is through a fund of funds, through syndication and convening, and through shared services, including access to our tech tools for reporting and knowledge sharing. And so now I'll bring you through a handful of examples of learnings we've had along the way and applying some of these different practices, some things that are working and some of the barriers that we're seeing. So first, there was a session yesterday that Nalini was in around nature-based finance. And one point that was brought up during that session that I really appreciated is that there are already practitioners that are participating in guiding, implementing nature-based solutions, and they're just not calling it that. They're farming using practices that protect biodiversity, they're seed saving, they're creating resilient local supply chains through co-ops. One region where this has been readily apparent within our network has been in Southern Appalachia, particularly in the Piedmont Triad area in North Carolina. There are multiple top research institutions, hundreds of millions of National Science Foundation and other sources of federal funding have been flowing for decades. There are strong local funders and networks like Mountain BizWorks and Appalachian Community Capital, and there's also a rich food and textile fiber ecosystem. And it's also the home of the largest historically Black college in the US, North Carolina A&T State University. Today, there's still a 50% gap in access to public funds between historically Black and tribal institutions and other land-grant institutions in the US. And it's because of how our funding formulas work. So there's also 3 private dollars right now for every 1 public dollar in the US land-grant university system, meaning our public resources have historically and continue to flow in direct alignment with those who have access to private wealth. And so we've partnered with the Small Farms Research and Innovation Center at A&T to provide in-kind access to our tech platform. And so this is non-financial resourcing is actually where we've started within this region, which unlocks access to public matching funds while directly supporting provision of mentorship, technical assistance to small farmers, and ultimately the growth of a cooperative ecosystem of local food and fiber enterprise in the region. This also helps them reach some of their measurement and reporting requirements to folks like USDA and NEFA so that they can continue to access the public funds that they need to do their work. And this effort has now expanded into economic development and into the Association of Research Directors of 1890s, which means it'll soon extend to all 19 historically Black colleges in the US. Another example of our work kind of pragmatically reaching folks where they are is that last year there was a particular week where I got like my 3rd phone call in the week where someone was saying, unless I raise, let's say, $1 million by the end of this month, then we're having to sell our land. And many of us in the room already know that that's one of the largest drivers of deforestation globally. And a lot of the advice that these projects was getting was, oh, well, why don't you just go into carbon credits? And of course, as you all know, especially if you have the span of a month, but even if they had tens of thousands of dollars accessible to them and several years and a PhD, that's a really big challenge for a lot of these grassroots efforts. And so while I'm glad there are many here that are working to continue to bridge that gap and make some of those asset classes a lot more accessible to these on-the-ground project developers, there's still a major just-in-time funding gap for these projects. And so what we decided to do was bring together about 30 different funders who wouldn't necessarily ordinarily be in the room with one another. We brought together philanthropy, venture, debt, blended finance, asset innovation, and we facilitated a 3-part design sprint. And we basically just said, okay, what are the different assets that are here in the room? What's prevented you from being able to fund projects like this one? We focused around a particular project in the Acre region in Brazil. And through that, we were able to identify, building on existing structures like the Community Investment Guarantee Pool in the US, which is an example of a bunch of philanthropic endowments that have been able to pool their resources to act as collateral in a revolving loan fund. We were able to put in place a structure that will allow recoverable grants and revolving loans to flow directly into these projects. And so that is an example of kind of bridging between an immediate need, using what we have, even though we might have kind of a wider vision of what can happen moving forward. And in closing, this is an example of some room that we still have to grow. So 3 years ago when we launched our first version of the Open Impact platform, we set out this idea that we'd support projects with distributed peer-to-peer real-time documentation of their activities and outcomes, fundamentally shift the power structures around kind of how value is defined from the grassroots up, provide direct pathways to peer-to-peer impact validation. And we built a tool that does that. And at the same time, we found that we actually spent the first 2 years meeting immediate funding reporting needs for these projects. And so they already had existing reporting standards they needed to meet for their public and private funders. So we did kind of 2 years of triage. And then when we finally reached the point where we said, okay, if you can measure and report anything, what would that be? They would say either, I don't know, you've never had time to think about that before. Or what do the funders want? And often the funders also didn't know the answer to those questions. Or what standards do I choose and why? Or I want to measure soil, but what tool do I use? And so I'd say realistically, we're collectively kind of navigating multiple fragmented markets, and that really gets around an access and accessibility and education gap that we're really focused on filling next. And so I'll leave us with a handful of questions around some of the remaining governance and access and compliance inquiries we're exploring in this work, and really looking forward to exploring it more with the panel here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin.
Hi, everyone. I am going to be talking to you today about our work at the BioFi project, building bioregional financing facilities, and how bioregional financing facilities can support corporations that want to engage in more effective place-based regeneration. So we at the BioFi project believe that we need to move beyond focusing on closing the nature finance gap that we all hear so much about. That we need to think about where resources are spent, how financing is structured, and who gets to make decisions about how those resources are allocated. And that these things are just as important as the quantum of capital being allocated. And that those resources indeed should support the transformation of systems, relationships, and worldviews if they are to be successful in addressing the ecological crisis and the polycrisis more broadly. So we believe that the innovations necessary to face the changes coming are already happening around the world at the bioregional level, and that communities are building networks of collaboration and solidarity, and that there's an opportunity for capital providers of all sorts, including impact investors and corporates, to support this work. So I'll quickly define some terms. Not everyone here might be familiar with what a bioregion is or what bioregionalism is. So we define a bioregion as a region that has unique physical characteristics, ecological characteristics, and cultural characteristics. So we think about the hard lines, soft lines, and human lines to define a geographic area that we focus on regenerating. And we believe that this approach to looking at regeneration is often more effective than taking a political approach where we're looking at straight lines that don't reflect what's actually happening in the ecosystem or the culture. And bioregionalism is a philosophy that supports communities to take this approach to organizing and to funding more place-based sovereign economies and developing governance structures that support that. So I co-authored a book that was published just a few months ago called Bioregional Financing Facilities, Reimagining Finance to Regenerate Our Planet, that lays out a lot of these ideas. And in it, we make the case for a new layer in the global financial system of what we call bioregional financing facilities. So a type of institution that serves as an intermediary or connective tissue between increasingly centralized financial resources and the very decentralized web of place-based regeneration happening around the world that is often eligible to capital holders and corporations that could benefit from partnering with those regenerators. So bioregional financing facilities have 3 objectives. They aim to decentralize financial resource governance, organize synergistic portfolios of projects, and to support the transition to bioregional regenerative economies. They have 12 attributes, which we lay out in the book, but I will not have time to cover all of them today. But a couple that I'll emphasize are that they support resource allocation in line with living systems principles, and here we draw on the physicist Friedrich Capra's work and his life principles, and they are in service to indigenous wisdom. So they are paying attention to the practices for regeneration that have been honed in a given landscape or watershed over millennia, and they are using these as guiding lights for how capital is invested. And importantly, they work to shift power imbalances that I know all of us here are well aware are often perpetuated through the capital structures that we are applying, even when we are working to try to support the empowerment of grassroots regenerative initiatives. So in the book, we lay out 4 templates for bioregional financing facilities, or what we call BFFs. The first is a bioregional trust, which essentially functions as a catalytic grant facility supporting regenerative projects in the bioregion, from the very small scale to a very large scale, like removing dams up and down a river is one of the projects we're working on. The second is a bioregional venture studio, which incubates a cohort of entrepreneurs focused on shifting a particular system in a given bioregion. And the system that most of our bioregional partners have focused on so far is food systems transformation. So in certain watersheds or certain landscapes, we're looking at how to support a cohort of entrepreneurs to develop all of the innovations necessary to shift that system so that it is more place-based and regenerative. The third BFF we look at is what we call a bioregional investment company. And this is when a bioregion is able to organize portfolios of projects that are a little bit more advanced. We recommend this come in phase 2 and not phase 1 of setting up bioregional financing facilities. And this is a portfolio of organizations that is generating financial returns, but also other types of returns that I'll speak to on the next slide. And the fourth bioregional financing facility is a bioregional bank, which functions very similarly to CDFIs or community development financial institutions. They provide low-interest loans, lines of credit, technical assistance, but they can even design and issue a currency, a nature-based currency perhaps, that helps to shift theories of value within the bioregion. So we take a 4 returns approach, drawing on the Common Land 4 returns framework, and look at inspiration returns, ecological returns, social returns, and financial returns, and the range of activities that can generate these various returns, and really encourage our investors to take a more holistic view to how they view returns, but also how they view risk, a longer-term view, and a view that looks at the need to invest in healthy ecosystems, healthy communities, and healthy culture to mitigate the risks that they're facing. So bioregional financing facilities we see are place-based incubators for investment and regeneration, and they can provide pathways for even multinational corporations that often seem to operate everywhere and nowhere at the same time to come back into relationship with the very real places and people that they are dependent on and are in turn impacting. And bioregional financing facilities, these new institutions that are serving as intermediaries and connective tissue and putting communities in charge of designing projects and how these resources are allocated, can support them in achieving healing and reciprocity through how they invest. We believe that through bioregional financing facilities, corporations can support bioregional regeneration through eco-credit purchases, regenerative commodity purchases, donations to donor-advised funds, through corporate stewardship programs, and employee donations. So there's more available here, but I'll leave it at that and really looking forward to your questions. I want to give a warm welcome to my friends Minari and Florencia, who just joined us.
And last but not least, Martine, please.
Thank you, Nalini, and thank you, SOCAP, and really thank you, Jacob, for inviting us to make those three breaths, because I think it's a very good context for the conversation we're having when we talk about nature as something that's outside or something that's on the balance sheet that we invest in and something that's actually that we're part of, right? Every breath we're taking is the oxygen that's produced by a living photosynthetic organism somewhere else. I don't have slides, but what I'll talk about is one of the programs that we do at Open Earth on actually building on everything that was said from Manuel's farms and thinking about the valuation, the natural valuation, to contextual capital, to bioregional finance facilities. How do we think about all of that in the context of a large natural capital accounting infrastructure and system at the global scale and even at the national level to push us to think, which is what we did in this work, on how do we even evolve our monetary system. At Open Earth, we do a lot of projects related to open source digital and data solutions. Some of them are very concrete, like cities use our tools for building their greenhouse gas inventories, but we also do some more forward-looking, big picture ideas, and this is definitely one of them that's really out there for us. I'll share a little bit of the story of how we came up to presenting a model for a nature-based currency that can be leveraged in the context of central banks. And it gave sort of like, why do we even start this discussion? I did a personal trip to a marine park in Costa Rica, and the plan from the government was to expand it 27 times, and I was there with the park rangers, and in conversation with them, I sensed that they didn't really want to enlarge the park, and I thought that was really strange. And they explained that's because when you have a marine park that you have to protect that's 27 times bigger, that normally falls on their same budget, it really lies on them to have to conserve all of that. And the point of that is that when we think about national parks or protected areas, for governments, for the most part, it's a cost. How am I going to fund this? We know we need it, but how do we fund it? And so the first thing is to rethink about is how do you really turn it not as a cost, but as a fundamental asset that, of course, sits on a balance sheet. Which balance sheet? So we started on one side designing new assets using techniques for monitoring, reporting, and verification for oceans. But then when we proposed how those could be leveraged, the actual central bank was really interested in this work and says, we have environmental accounts in the central bank that are just spreadsheets. Why don't we think about actually bringing into concrete assets? And so that led to say, well, actually, let's start doing this work in collaboration with central banks as one possible institution, but it's not all. We can totally think about this from a bioregional bank instead of a central bank. So I'll talk a little bit about like why think about nature-based currencies and in that context. For me, one of the key things is, of course, the double-edged sword of thinking about the valuation of nature, because in many ways it's priceless, right? It's really hard to say, well, how do we put a price to the Amazon, right? But at the same time, if we don't use mechanisms that we can really interact with, it's always in decline. The second part, which is quite relevant in the context of big targets like 30% conservation by 2030, we often see the context of very fiscally indebted countries with a lot of nature richness, and their actual pressure, let's think about Brazil and the Amazon, their actual pressure of actually encroaching on their nature is because of a constant cycle of indebtedness, often in the dynamic between global north and south. So instead of asking from a global south nature-rich country for the global north to pay for the conservation, if we flip the switch, is, well, we're not poor, we're rich, so generate that capital. Actually mint their own capital that you need to conserve those vast amounts of area and protected biodiversity. And the third aspect of why think about this design is to create a mechanism of incentives where it's the health of nature is linked to your national economy or some international economy in some sense, that if you destroy your nature, your economy collapses. And if you protect your nature, your economy grows. And so money, in many ways, can play a role of playing that linkage. And it's so critical to take it to the level of how do we think about the evolution of money, because money is a social construction, right? It's based on the stories that we tell each other, and we can change those stories, and we've changed them over time. And even more recently, today, Bitcoin is still at 1.4 trillion in market cap, and that's capital that didn't exist before. So we can generate capital based on new stories. The question is, what are those stories that we want to tell ourselves? What is implied in terms of what we published and been working on is, on one side, the accounting aspect of how do you think about every square kilometer over a year in terms of the ecosystem services that it has, the biodiversity. So think about a national system of natural capital accounting and what the different things that can empower. And it's not just currency, which is perhaps a visible manifestation, but it could be as simple or as complex as a nature-backed treasury bill, something that you issue federal debt to fund national interest projects, or even underlying eco-credits or mechanisms to evaluate some of the projects that we just heard. The currency in itself, similar to how currencies are minted, also looks at the stocks and flows of nature. Like what is the core asset in, let's say, a large area like the Amazon, but what are the annual sort of flows that it produces in terms of ecosystem services? So one of the possibilities is to mint capital from those annual services that it generates that are proven to, among other things, finance the conservation actions to protect that underlying asset or principle. One of the things that I did to sort of test this idea when I was meeting with natural park rangers in Costa Rica, I said, if the country would issue its own currency that's attached to the health of nature, and part of your salary would be paid with their currency, would you accept part of your salary? Raise your hand, and they all went like, yes. So how do we inject that system into the economy? There's different ways in terms of funding what often goes into conservation cost. I'll talk. There's a couple of like hows as well, and they're certainly not easy. And one of the complex things is agreeing on what we think about monitoring, reporting, and verification, which involves in carbon credits and biodiversity things, and the interoperability of them. So the asset that's in one country or in one bioregion can be interoperate, or we can see it like to like with others. So that's really hard. But one of the things that we focused on in terms of the how is quite critical to how to make this work, which is what we're really valuing is a system and a complex system that's alive. So we cannot think about, again, the Amazon as the collection of trees and jaguars and animals, because if you take them apart, you really are parting it. So you really have to see it as a living system, that if you take it out and you liquidate it, as we often do with mortgage-backed assets, or you kill it, right? So you have to represent it as a living system in the balance sheet. And so to do that, what we put forward as an interesting area of research is in the evolution of AI. How can AI deal with a lot of that complexity and represent living systems? And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is how to think about nested AIs. Probably most people have been interacting with generative AIs that has a lot of context in terms of text. That's how GPT transformers are trained in text context. But when we think about a living system-based AI support, it's one AI that maybe is representing a bioregion or a farm inside a bioregion that has to be inside a larger context, which is Earth, right? So how do we think about an AI that really understands the complexities of Earth and the different scales? So it's a very forward-looking vision, but quite doable. And one of the things that has been surprising for us with some of these big ideas is the amount of appetite from countries and central banks on one side, particularly countries that, for example, Palau or others in Southeast Asia that operate under US dollar, that are probably underwater in the context of climate change in the future. And so they have a lot of room for innovation in terms of how they deal with a more nature-based economy. But really, it's going back to the context of the panel around corporate lens. It's to really shift from ESG into beyond ESG, we have to really think at it at different scales. And so hopefully this brings that global perspective and a possibility that maybe in the not long distance future we can invite some of these bigger macro changes. And I'll pause there for Q&A.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's a lot of input for a set of very complex questions. I feel that I learned a lot about many tools, going from sort of merging different funding sources to AI, to focusing on a sort of a novel scale of bioregionalism, which I think is really super interesting. One of the things that I was struck by as I listened to the four of you was the range of scales that all of you have been working at. From the small scale of individual farms to different sort of regions and bioregions, and you at the sort of global and planetary scale. And I'm wondering if you guys as a panel could talk about the three questions that I originally posed about how do we move the corporate world to take time for deeper connections, what sort of new financial tools we might need, and how do we go about currency-tizing the multiple values of nature. About how you have dealt with working at different scales, both in terms of time scales, but also in terms of spatial scales, and wondering whether there might be some congruence or leapfrogging or stepping from one scale to another in time and in space. Could you talk about that collectively? And I won't call on any of you, but maybe Samantha, it sounds like you can jump right in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. For me, we need to start at the relational scale. And if you think about a global multinational corporation and you think about people that are stewarding a landscape or a watershed, these are at opposite ends of the scale spectrum. And a question that I've been holding is how do we bring these two ends of the pole back into relationship with each other and heal the extraction and often destruction that those corporations have created in watersheds and landscapes that are creating real business risks for them. And I believe that through finding the right people in corporations that want to be a part of, the listening and regeneration process at the landscape and watershed scale, that healing and return to right relationship is possible. And, usually that involves a few people from the corporation going to that place, learning about what's happening there ecologically, culturally, in terms of the organizing and activism, and making a commitment to start to build trust with the people in that place, recognizing that, whether they're continuing to work in that place or source commodities from that place, or they've done so historically, they have reasons to be there and support what we call high integrity biocultural regeneration that is deep and lasting and can withstand the changing climate and the other ecological changes that we're facing right now. And from there, they can explore what are the different ways financially the corporation can support the regenerative activities in that place. And one of the starting points we're looking at is various types of eco-credits, but moving beyond highly reductionist, mechanistic, just carbon credits where you're focused on a single molecule, to where you're paying the community for stewardship or regeneration practices, and you're enabling them to define what those practices are. And the corporation and the community is sitting down side by side to develop a methodology that meets both of their needs, that meets the needs for restoring the watershed so that the company that's dependent on water in that place has their business needs met, but the community is sharing their intelligence of how to take care of that watershed and how to ensure that the needs of the community are also met. So that's one way we're thinking about bridging those skills.
Thank you. And Kaitlin, I'm sure you have something to say.
Sure. I think I'm thinking of this question through both the lens of scale as a noun and scale as a verb, because I think that second one's really important within this context. I would actually say a lot of the initial inspiration behind our work and kind of how we work is in response to what we've seen as kind of the runaway scaling, the copy-paste kind of model of scaling that's gotten us here, that's caused a lot of the harms that we're now working to remediate. And so when we think about scale, the noun, in our work, we've been really working at, we found it really essential to actually work from the edges. So both kind of a deeply grassroots scale and a deeply global scale. And the way in which we've been approaching that is through supporting practice and resourcing and documentation at a hyper-local scale, but then also providing the spaces for the sharing of knowledge and best practices and kind of collective forward learning at that global scale. And the lens through which we've been delivering that is actually through kind of a living library lens. What would it look like if we supported the tools for those at the grassroots to document, hey, this is what I did, this is how I measured it, here's how I delivered the training. Some things worked for us. And so maybe if that works for you, you can start at 80%. And modify that for your unique ecological and social context. So it allows for some of that agility without the assumption that, a rubber stamp is going to work kind of across multiple unique ecological and social contexts.
Great, thanks. Manuel.
Thank you. I would just like to add an example. We have a project that's 2.5 million acres in Namibia, and just one sense of reality, it's insane. You are in a Cessna, just to give you some background there, you hop on a Cessna, 2 hours later, you're still flying through that landscape. This is how big it is. So assuming that we're going to regenerate it in one go is, no one will believe you. So the way we started was 2 years ago, starting with subsamples of that landscape, multiple regeneration activities, a mosaic approach, prove it with catalytic capital. We got grants and other types of funding from Mulago Foundation and many others, to the point that we have now the full case, the full data room that can go into a nature-backed outcome bond and other facilities that are attracting very large pools of capital to drop into a landscape like that. But we had to build it and keep proving that point.
Excellent. Martin, did you have anything to add to that?
Not a lot. I think everyone covered the things that I was thinking.
Okay, great. Yes, you did. Yes,
both
you did a
both
great
in the
job of
relationship
that.
and then also the scale. I mean, I'm a big advocate to thinking on those scales.
A question from the audience is, what is your take on the potentials and pitfalls of biodiversity credits? What have we learned from previous efforts creating biodiversity credits? This is a great question. I think we're at a time, from what I know in impact investing, where biodiversity credits have done some learning from carbon credits, but we still have a long way to go, and wondering if you have encountered, any of you four, have encountered that as a tool or as a unit of input that has been helpful or not helpful to you.
Yeah.
Martin, you have something to say about that?
I guess I already.
I guess you do, yeah.
And we've faced a lot of this because we published like the design of a biodiversity credit, particularly in oceans, and oceans are really hard because they're moving all the time. One of the pitfalls that we see and we try to solve for is thinking about the biodiversity credit and the carbon credit and the plastic credit. How do you put them together and understand them from a more spatial and temporal sense? So actually the base unit for our marine biodiversity protection credit is, let's say, a square kilometer over a year. So that's the base unit, and it aligns with our proposal on the global sort of like natural capital infrastructure that also aligns with the UN system of environmental economic accounting. So that's one thing, is put them contextualizing into a common base unit. The other pitfalls, of course, in biodiversity is it's really hard to measure. In the case of oceans, it's even hard. In land, things like eDNA and others can be very helpful, or even satellite imagery. In the case of oceans, it's a lot harder. But so we take proxy species, or we take different metrics in terms of. So that's one of the really hard things. The third one, which is probably the hardest one, but the way to address it is to, again, not think about like biodiversity credit registries with their own MRV as isolated, but in the global context. And that relates to linkages. So if, let's say, we're looking at a marine protected area in Costa Rica and we say, well, the hammerhead sharks, that show up there are a measure of our biodiversity health. But then you have an El Nino year, and it changes the temperature in the area, and then the hammerhead showers just go down, and they just won't show up for a couple of years, right? So now what happened with your biodiversity? It's not gone. I mean, it's just like changes. So what happened somewhere else is actually affecting you, or 2 countries above, their nitrogen runoffs is affecting your local context, and so how do you relate with that? Because you can affect your own policies, but you can't affect, if you're Costa Rica, Nicaragua's policies in some sense. So those linkages are very important to see how you're measuring at one level, how it relates to the global level. And it's, I think, why the hard thing, but the invitation is to think about not registries and credits in silos, but we have to really leapfrog into a global system that how we're tracking everything in context.
I'll take a question from the audience. One concern around some of the approaches shared is who owns the land asset at the end of the day? For example, highly indebted countries, including the US, seem vulnerable to having public land assets and values and resources end up in private hands. Is this something that any of you has encountered in terms of a concern or an actual action?
Yeah, so I'll share from. Did I jump that queue? Sorry.
No, go ahead, Manuel.
We like the question.
Yeah, we really like this question. So the way we take it is back to due diligence. So the first thing that we want to make sure is that when we're looking at that acre, that we're putting it in the right social context. And the first, call it red flag, that we need to pass is that we are not going to be displacing communities. So that it's as simple as that. Is that natural regeneration project, that natural capital project, going to be displacing a community? If the answer to that is yes, then it's a different approach. We need to find another way of making that project happen. Now, what has continued to happen to us is that those land stewards, in many cases, I would say mostly in the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they tend to be more liquid assets in the sense that it's more normal for those lands to be changing hands. And what we've started to see is that when a land steward really wants to sell their land, which happens a lot, is there a way that we can tie the project as much as possible to having an option or a right of first refusal to the acquisition of that land? But what has just happened to us, and I wanted to prep for this panel, is that the example that I put there in the north of Mexico, it has a couple of lands that were being sold. And we thought that some of the large conglomerates wanted to buy them. It turned out because of the nature regeneration that has been going on for 2 years, there now has, if you saw in the background, a couple of palm-like trees that the Kickapoo tribe really cares about them from a spiritual perspective. But it only is valuable to them because those palms are there. So now the land owner is the Kickapoo tribe in many of our partnerships. So we're starting to see that cycle when there's something that goes beyond the value of that original natural capital asset that has a spiritual value that drives further investment by other groups that would otherwise not be there. So it just provides a different lens where we're seeing lands now move to indigenous groups that are happy actually to pay a premium for a spiritual value. This is way beyond the carbon or the biodiversity set of attributes that asset can have. But it's a matter putting contractually, how do we protect those land stewards around the project?
Great. Did anyone else want to address that question?
I think probably all have something to say.
Yeah. Just have a few minutes.
Partly in terms of ownership of land, but also we think about ownership of nature, which is a crazy concept as well, like who owns nature, and it owns itself, and among other things, we are owned by nature in some sense. And I would say, yeah, seeing the pressure of a country to go from public land to private land is part of the problems that I was articulating. To have that pressure, we have to move beyond ownership to stewardship. So it doesn't matter. It's just sort of like who's the steward. And then in that case, bringing the value and the importance of stewarding that land is critical. But I totally see how private sector could be great stewards of nature. So that I don't. What I presented at least is not just apply for public land. It's a national registry that has public and private working together, but with that common stewardship in mind.
Great, thanks.
I'll just quickly add
Sure.
that at the BioFi project, we are quite concerned that this wave of capital that is growing, that is allocated for investing in, quote, nature, could lead to the further privatization, commodification, and financialization of land assets at a time when we really believe we need to be investing in deepening and expanding the commons. So bioregional financing facilities provide financial and governance approaches to structuring investment in land that is held and governed in a commons.
And Kaitlin, I think I sense that you have something else to
I will
say.
briefly punctuate that as lofty as we like to be sometimes in talking about asset innovation, at the end of the day, we're dealing with term sheets and financial regulators, and like there's kind of a finite number of building blocks that we're actually dealing with there, which I find both, I think that helps clarify some of the risks and concerns there down to two things, which is one, I do have some concerns around the extent to which when we're talking about kind of leapfrogging quote unquote innovation into some of the most already sort of climate impacted areas in the world, how do we make sure we're also not pushing the volatility and compliance risk of sort of adopting some of these new assets downstream? And also from a governance perspective, how can we pragmatically simply ensure that we are making, structuring these investments in a way that are looking at ownership differently, that we're looking at non-dilutive forms of investment, that we're looking at kind of revenue share tied assets and other things that are not transferring that risk around land ownership and other forms of ownership.
Great, thanks for all of those. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but we will, I think all of us can stay here, so if you have a question that you weren't able to ask and we weren't able to respond to, please feel free to stay after for that. We have a couple minutes just for me to sort of pull up what I sort of take from this as the moderator. I started out this conversation with this idea of this tension between despair and hope when it comes to thinking about nature and impact investing. And I have to say, after this panel, I feel a lot more hope than despair, which I think is really great. It's great when you can walk out of a room talking about such really potentially heavy matters as not just the ecological issues, but also the accompanying social issues that are going on in our world today. First, I think there's sort of 5 things that I picked up that I sense are in the arena of hope rather than despair. First, I heard many different approaches, and also many different geographical regions are being encompassed in this idea of how do we work with nature-based solutions. Secondly, I heard some instances of how the panel members are putting out what they've learned to share freely with other people. The databases that Kaitlin is talking about with her repositories of information about how the work that she's done and she and her colleagues have done are now available. The book that you've written, Samantha, is something I can't wait to dig into. So I think there's hope in terms of the sharing, and especially in the realm of investing and business and finance that can often be proprietary and closed. I think this area is really much more open, which is, to me, very hopeful. Third, we did sort of explore a range of spatial and temporal scales, which makes me think about there are maybe leapfrogging and building blocks that we can use rather than focusing just on the isolated case studies that were described. Fourth, there was a range of both existing tools as well as new tools that are being explored at the financial level that are being used in isolation, but also in combination, which I thought was really wonderful. And fifth, I guess, even though this is somewhat of a new area in impact investing, this idea of nature assets and nature-based solutions, I also think there's some very mature thinking that's going on here. That's integration, that's synthetic. And to me, that is also very hopeful that we're already at a stage where we can start putting together, assembling, and weaving together ideas and practices that all of you are exploring. So thank you so much for these hopeful messages. I know there's still lots of work to do, you. I'll just mention that at the Sorensen Impact Institute, Janice Dubno, who's in the back here, she's just raising her hand, Valentine, who's her assistant, and not assistant, but her colleague, I guess I should say, and I and others are working, we're just beginning work, we'll be starting work in January on a sort of a landscape analysis of what's going on with nature-based solutions and these kinds of both ecological and environmental work, but also the financial and impact investment aspects of that. So if you're interested in keeping up with that, we would be delighted to share that work with you.